Go to item 11, and that's another proposed plan change on amendments to the Historic Heritage Schedule. And Senior Advisor Special Projects Emma Rush has written this report, and Heritage Manager Noel Reardon is also with us. Emma, we've read your paper. I think you are going to take us through paragraph 23 and maybe some key points of attachment A.
Good morning, everyone. This is the second of two plan changes to correct errors and update information in Schedule 14.1, which is the Historic Heritage Schedule. It's very similar to the previous plan change. It relates to 73 places in the schedule. The difference between this one and previous ones is that it proposes to delete a number of places from the plan change, including 2 places that have been demolished by fire and have subsequently been, damaged by fire and have subsequently been demolished via resource consent, and 9 places which have been reviewed and have been found not to meet the criteria and thresholds in the RPS. And I can quickly take you through these 9 places now. The first one is a residence in Herald Island, which was relocated from Parakai in the 1980s. It has no historic link to the site or locality and required substantial modification as part of its relocation. This place was scheduled in Oratia as a double bay villa, but was actually constructed in the 1960s from 2 relocated villas joined together by a second floor extension. It also has no known historical associations or links to people, events, or periods of significance. This residence in New Lynn has no known historical significance. The house is visually distinctive for its unusual form and proportions, but the significance of this distinction is unknown. This, we believe, may have been a farmhouse from the early 1900s. It's been subject of a number of alterations and extensions, so its original form is almost illegible. Little is known of the history of this place, and the information that we do have is largely speculative. This house was relocated to its site in the 1950s or 60s. It's named Vila House, but that family have only been associated with it since the 1990s. It's been the subject of various alterations and wouldn't be considered a representative example of its type any longer. This residence in Milford is one of the oldest houses in Milford, but substantial modifications have severely compromised the place. Half of the house was removed in the 1920s, so only half of it remains. And the setting and context has been completely lost over time due to subdivision and development around the residence. This cottage we have some historical information about, but it's largely speculative and really relates to the land rather than the cottage itself. It's been significantly extended and modified. It's almost triple its original size and has new door and window openings, so it doesn't represent what was originally there. This residence in Manurewa does have some interest historically for the land ownership, which was related to the dairy industry, but the value of that is difficult to attribute to the house. Modifications have compromised the integrity and the setting and the original context, which was the dairy farm that it was originally set on, have been completely lost over time. And this last place is a 1949 modern style house. It's quite unusual for its use of adobe bricks, and it is an example of a modern style home, but while those facts are interesting, there's no evidence showing the place is historically or socially significant. So those are 9 of the 11 places proposed to be deleted in this plan change.
So that's 9 of the 11. The other 2?
The other 2 were damaged by fire and have been demolished via resource consent, so no longer exist.
That was Mangere, 79 Coronation Road, Mangere Bridge.
That's correct.
And
Oh, sorry, there's a slight error in this report. The Coronation Road Mangere Bridge is one that was demolished by fire damaged by fire and subsequently demolished. And the other one is in Waiwera Bathhouse.
Thank you. Okay. Right, members, questions on this paper? I've got a move, and Councillor Clove. Question, Councillor Watson?
Yeah, just a question, a kind of general question, but geared in some ways towards the residents at Ferry Parade and Herald Island. Mm-hmm. Now that was I think an 1880s farmhouse, you said, that had been relocated and then modified. Mm-hmm. To the casual observer, that one and possibly even the one like in Milford look reasonably historical if you didn't know. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the criteria and the thresholds that you consider, to what extent does the modification be of such significance that it drops off the radar? Is it external or internal, or a combination of the both?
The regional policy statement has a number of criteria which each scheduled historic heritage place is assessed against when it's evaluated, and a heritage expert in our team has reviewed all of these places looking at those criteria. So they include the historical, but also things like the physical attributes. So the Ferry Island one, for example, was scheduled as a representative villa, but substantial alterations in this heritage expert's view mean that the representative qualities of that place have been degraded. And so under the regional policy statement, a place needs to have at least considerable value against one of the criteria, and also considerable value at least to its locality or beyond. So the re-evaluation of each of these places found that some of them still had moderate values under some of those criteria, but overall they didn't meet that bar to be significant enough to be to have that management under the unitary plan.
Okay, and just to follow up, Mr. Chair, if I may, in terms of relocation then, how significantly does that weigh? And in the areas where there is virtually no historic dwellings, is there a lesser threshold there, or are they just seen as the same as anywhere across Auckland?
Well, in answer to your second question, so the regional policy statement has two levels that are of significance in terms of the location, and one is that it needs to be of considerable importance to its locality, so that allows for the differences across the city, and then if it is of importance on a wider scale, that sort of elevates it higher. In terms of the relocation, it's I think it depends what the importance of the place was. If the importance was its setting in context and the history where it was originally, and it's been moved, you obviously are going to lose some of that. But if the importance is still represented once it has been relocated, then it could still meet those thresholds.
Councillor Wayne Walker.
A couple of questions. So I'm just looking at the schedule that's here, and on page 4, you've got the St Stephen's Anglican Church, which is up in Whakaproa. I'm making the assumption that there isn't any change around that.
Sorry, which place was that?
It's on page 4, page 131.
Sorry, there is a change to that. So that place is currently identified with just a dot in the unitary plan instead of a mapped polygon showing where the area the historic heritage overlay applies to. So we're just removing that dot and applying a polygon to show the area that the historic heritage rules apply.
And is there any change here? I note exclusions, it has the interior of the building, which is the church.
That's correct. And
So is that a change?
That's not a change, but if you see in that exclusions column, buildings and structures that are not the primary feature and freestanding signs, so we're adding those as what we call exclusions. Exclusions are features of a heritage place that are either detracting or neutral in terms of their heritage value. And that church has had a significant redevelopment around it, so it has a new church adjacent to this building. And we obviously don't want to protect that for historic heritage reasons, so that's been identified as an exclusion to the scheduling.
So are you suggesting that that applies to the new church, not the old church?
That's correct. So the old church is the primary feature. It's in the column there, and it's the 1917 church. That's the primary part of that place that we're trying to protect. And then the newer buildings, which have no historic heritage value, are identified as an exclusion.
Okay, it's not obvious to me in reading this
Yeah,
that there's a difference between the new church and the old church.
Right.
So when I read interior of buildings that are not the primary feature, that is referring to the new church as compared to the existing church.
Sorry, the interior of the existing church is also not included in the scheduling.
So we just have a question, why would that be, given that it's a public place, it's an historic church, and the inside, I would have thought, was quite historical?
Presumably it's been modified over time. I don't know the answer to that question, but a lot of places have been changed significantly, so the interior may have been changed.
Okay, so I'm just raising the question here because in this case the church has been modified back close to the original. So yes, it's been modified, but the modification is actually in keeping with its.
Identify the new buildings on the site as being excluded.
And then at a later point in time, somebody will make the call, well, it no longer bears any historical resemblance, so take it off. When in point of fact, if we're actually maintaining the line, it's possible to put buildings back to their original condition rather than the reverse. So how do we approach that?
It's a very good question. I mean, the rules and the historic heritage overlay, we certainly hope try and stop people from doing those kind of modifications that detract from the place. We would hope that if people were applying for those kind of activities, that those would be declined. And the rules also do encourage people to look after and reveal heritage features, for example, that have been covered up and improve their buildings over time.
So it's a related question. Is there any rates relief for historical buildings or the like?
No.
No. Okay.
Thank you. Member Nominee.
Just a simple question. It's in the proposed plan change on page 25, the reference to the Māori interest one that's being removed. Was that essentially, said it was an error? Is that just, it jumped into a wrong table or something between the legacy document and the current one?
Sorry,
page 25, amendment to place of Māori interest or significance. Refers to a mill site at the Botanic Gardens.
Are you referring to the mill site in the Botanic Gardens? Is that the
Yeah,
one? Yes.
yeah.
So that place was wrongly identified as being of Maori interest or significance during the rollover to the unitary plan. It's
Is it just a technical error
it's a
rather than a
European
assumption?
error.
Yeah, but sometimes European sites can have Māori interest, so
Yes.
but it was a technical error.
That's
error.
correct.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Member Nominee. And Councillor Fletcher, please.
Well, we don't often have the opportunity to see you before us. I just wondered if you can give us, and this may not be the appropriate place, but at some point to this committee, an update on St James and Esplanade Road and also St James on Queen Street.
Through the chair, I'm happy to do that in some way that would suit members. It's interesting, we just had a briefing from our lawyers on the St James Esplanade Road lessons. So I'm not sure how you would like me to do that, but I agree this is probably not the right time for both of them. I will be bringing a report on Carlisle House, which is one of the other buildings of interest to the committee in the future. So I'm happy to provide that sort of update on both the buildings you've asked for at some other time.
Yeah, let's just make sure we land it at the right committee though, because I think one might fall into Councillor Cooper's committee, not planning, so we just need to make sure it sits at the right committee, but thank you. We'll follow up on that, and I have had a discussion on St James Queen Street as well.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I guess the one with Esplanade Road is really, the concern for me is whether or not there are any implications in terms of precedent setting for other buildings that are currently scheduled. So whilst I understand that you might see that some of that work could take place at the Regulatory Committee, I think in a broader planning sense, that is something that I'd like to see come back here.
Okay. I'll discuss that with Councillor Cooper, because I don't want to assume that something sits here, but we've, Councillor Cooper and I have dealt with these things before, and we just are very pragmatic about where things should fall. But take your point, so thank you.
No, I just want to ask some questions if I could.
Question, yes.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit concerned, given the sensitivities around heritage. I think the views of the Heritage Advisory Panel need to be sought, formally or informally, but because 15% of the buildings and places that went through that rigorous unitary plan, painful unitary plan process to be chopped out at this stage may cause concerns. It may not, but I'm just worried that we need to have the best, widest possible buy-in on this one, rather than somebody throwing their hands up in horror. 15% seems a hell of a lot, and it's a one-way valve. And there's not 15 replacements, worthy replacements that are out there. Is there any comment on Noel on that?
So I do take every plan change to the Heritage Advisory Panel, but in these sorts of instances, it's at a general level. It's not site specific, because in some cases it's confidential, and in some cases members of the advisory panel have interests. So my practice is at the moment just to say we're putting a plan change which will make amendments to the schedule. I guess what I would say is this is the first plan change we're bringing to you with deletions, and we've made quite an effort to point those deletions out, because we realise this is the first one, but it won't be the last. Because when we're out there and looking at these buildings, landowners are applying for consents, it's quite clear that many of these buildings, well, not many, some of the buildings that Legacy Council scheduled don't meet the criteria in the RPS, and we have a program of work which is aimed to have a robust schedule in the next unitary plan review time, and that robustness includes fixing up all the errors, removing buildings that should not be there, and adding sites. So I would anticipate in 10 years' time you have a robust schedule with probably more sites scheduled than you've got now. But I'm quite happy if the committee would like me to take this to the Heritage Advisory Panel. I would argue that it shouldn't happen with this plan change, but subsequent ones, if we have deletions, I don't have a problem with that either. It does get a bit tricky though, because of the timing issue.
So just to clarify that, the question for us today is to approve this. So I don't really want to see the approval held up, but once it is notified, there's opportunity for you to take it. And Councillor Lee, as chair, you could request a presentation on once it's notified. You happy with that?
it may be necessary to, perhaps we could to change the schedule of the panel meeting, which the next one come out next month, I think, and bring
It's
it
after
forward.
Easter.
And to be inclusive about this. I think it's a principle that's at stake here. 50% of buildings and places just gone with the stroke of a pen may well cause concern.
So I'm not sure where the 15% comes from.
So 11 of the 73?
No, there are in the schedule there are 2,226 sites scheduled. I would say there's probably about 100 that shouldn't be, and we will slowly bring plan changes to you, just like we've done identifying why they don't meet the criteria. I would say by the time that program's finished, we will have brought to you recommendations to add a couple of hundred. So in totality, the schedule will be more comprehensive. It will be reflective of the question that was raised earlier about the distribution, that many of the sites that we're putting forward for removal are on the councils that didn't necessarily have, the legacy councils that didn't have the resources at the time to do a proper job, and I can speak authoritatively on that because I was the county planner that was responsible for scheduling 2 of those, and it was done on a very ad hoc basis. So
73 historic heritage places to be amended or corrected or whatever, but 15% of those to be deleted. That's the concern.
Of the, so what was the first plan change? 145. So the first plan change had 145 amendments. This is the second plan change, which has 73 amendments. So
No, amendments, not necessarily absolute deletion.
no, they're just, most of those amendments are in response, like Councillor Walker raised. Legacy Council had a dot showing where the heritage building was. We're putting a polygon around it, which extends the level of protection. Legal descriptions are wrong. The mapping is wrong. So there is no change really to the protection afforded to the buildings.
So I'm recommending that we proceed.
What I suggest we resolve this. It's a question of form and principle, really. We have these advisory panels, and sometimes I feel they're not respected or their views are not taken sufficiently seriously. So what I suggest is in this recommendation C, where there's last minute editing or changing, I think if we could put in there that I'm quite happy to join the group, and that if there are any suggested changes or comments, we circulate the advisory panel by email. Maybe nothing will come back, but if there is something that can be raised at that point, does that make sense?
Okay, look, I'm happy to get some feedback on that. I think we can accommodate that. I'll definitely add Councillor Lee's name. So Chair, Deputy, Councillor Lee. Actually, in terms of the Independent Māori Statutory Board, just on this matter, members Namani and Hanare, are you comfortable if I was probably thinking of your name, Member Namani. Can we insert that there now just to, or is that something the IMSB needs to discuss?
Can we confirm it? We can confirm it early next week.
Okay. Thank you. So, Councillor Lee, you've included your reference there, Councillor Lee.
And yes, I'm happy to do that, and I'll talk with Mr. Reid, and we'll get this information out to the panel, and then we'll come back. Okay. Because I'm sure that Mr. Reid will be part of those final discussions too.
Councillor Lee, would you move?
I'm happy to move.
Wait a second, please. I have a question. I'll go to Councillor Wallace. And a question, Councillor.
Thank you. I just want to be careful about process, because if we say that you're signing it off before it goes out to public consultation, but then you consult with a group, that concerns me that that's not proper process.
Yeah, look, we are having, it's
So we
checks,
can't-
a
we
check
can't-
here, and it's an advisory panel as opposed to the public generally, and I
Well-
think there's a willingness to do that.
I don't know, I just don't know what precedent it sets if we start doing that for every plan change, and which advisory board do we pick and how does it go on, and that concerns me, but I think we need to have a proper.
It's not mine, it falls
I'm speaking, thanks,
outside
my
the recommendation,
speaking
doesn't
turn,
it? And
thank
then
you.
they have to go
My
to another avenue.
Can I just check? I'm just trying to listen to everybody's viewpoints here.
Well, I was viewpoints for minor amendment.
Yeah, and you're up for it.
That's the risk, might not be.
No big precedent. Setting here.
I have some concerns, and in this instance, I think we can live with it. I would not want to see this as a precedent. Having said that, this is public information. Most heritage plan changes are confidential. This one isn't. So we're not notifying it till the end of April. If this is the committee's view, then we have time to do that.
Members, I'm willing to accommodate Councillor Lee's input here and move forward as the recommendations are on the board. Further speakers on this? I'll put it to the vote then. All those in favour say aye.